There is a kind of loneliness that hits you in a room full of people you know, not strangers, people who've known your name for years, who know your history, your face when something is wrong, your laugh when it's real versus when it's polite. And somehow sitting right next to them, you feel it, this quiet, strange gap. Like everyone is speaking a language you used to be fluent in. And somewhere along the way, without noticing, you forgot the words. You're still there, still nodding, still smiling when it's time to smile. But something in you has already left. 3 seconds. You know the version of yourself that used to be easier to be. The one who laughed at the right moments, not because anything was funny, but because the room expected it, who softened their opinion the second they sensed disagreement coming, who said yes to the invitation not out of any real desire, but out of that quiet, familiar fear of what it would mean to say no, who sat across from people they'd known for years and felt held, not because the connection was deep, but because the performance was comfortable, and comfortable felt like enough. You were good at it. Most people are. Most people spend their entire lives getting better at it. And then something shifted. Not dramatically, not with a breakdown or a single moment you can point to and say, there, that's when it happened. It was slower than that, more like a tide going out than a storm coming in. You started noticing things you couldn't unnotice, the way certain conversations left you feeling hollowed out instead of connected, the way laughter in certain rooms had a slightly mechanical quality, too fast, too loud, landing half a beat before anything was actually funny, the way you'd catch yourself mid-sentence and realize you didn't believe the thing you were saying, that you were saying it because it was expected, because the alternative, saying what you actually thought, felt like a risk no one had agreed to take with you. So you drove home quiet, and the silence in the car felt more like you than anything you said all evening. If that is familiar, if that silence is somewhere you've been spending more and more time, then I want to say one thing before we go any further. That is not you pulling away from life. Machiavelli, a man who watched human nature more honestly than almost anyone who ever lived, would recognize exactly what is happening to you, not as a crisis, not as damage, as the beginning of something most people are too afraid to let themselves become. This video is about that, about why you stopped fitting in, what it actually means, and what Machiavelli understood about the price of becoming real in a world that rewards the performance. 1. The mask you forgot you were wearing. Most people don't know they're performing. That's the thing that makes it so hard to talk about. If someone asks them, are you being real right now, or are you playing a role? They would say real immediately without hesitation. Because for them, the performance became the reality so long ago that there is no longer any felt difference between the two. That's not hypocrisy. That's just what happens when a mask stays on long enough. Machiavelli spent his whole life in the courts and councils of Florence watching powerful men operate. And what he noticed, what he kept coming back to in everything he wrote, was that most men are not actually operating from who they are. They are operating from who they need to appear to be. And the dangerous ones, the ones who eventually lost everything, were not the ones who played the game badly. They were the ones who forgot they were playing a game at all. He called this the central trap of political life. But he was really describing something much more universal, something that starts not in the halls of power, but in the ordinary rooms of childhood. You were a kid. You felt things fully and showed what you felt without any calculation. You cried when you were sad. You were angry when something was wrong. You told the truth with the kind of directness that adults find charming in small doses and deeply uncomfortable in larger ones. You were, in other words, completely yourself. And then the corrections came. Not with cruelty, mostly just with the slow, relentless machinery of approval and disapproval. Don't be so sensitive. Stop being so dramatic. Be nice. Smile. Settle down. What will people think? Every one of those moments taught you something. Certain parts of you, the too loud parts, the too honest parts, the parts that felt too much, those parts needed to be made smaller, quieter, more manageable, more acceptable to the room. So you made them smaller, and you got something in return. You got belonging, you got warmth, you got the relief of being accepted rather than corrected. and that felt worth it. For a long time, it felt completely worth it. Machiavelli understood this transaction at a structural level. He wrote that men are so simple and so subject to present necessities that whoever wishes to deceive will always find someone willing to be deceived. He meant it about political manipulation. But read it again in the context of what we do to ourselves. We are the ones doing the deceiving, and we are the ones being deceived. We construct a version of ourselves that gets approval, that meets the present necessities of the room, the family, the group. And then we live inside that construction so completely that we forget it is a construction. We stop being able to tell the difference between what we actually feel and what we've trained ourselves to feel in order to be accepted, between what we actually believe and what we've learned to say in order to belong. This is not a character flaw. Machiavelli never saw it as one. He saw it as a survival strategy, a rational response to the real demands of social life. The problem, he said, is when the strategy outlives its usefulness. When the man who learned to wear a mask to survive a dangerous environment keeps wearing it long after the danger has passed. When the performance that protected you in one chapter of life becomes the thing that prevents you from living fully in the next. Because there comes a point, and you may be standing at it right now, when the mask and the face have been fused for so long that taking it off feels genuinely terrifying. Not because you're weak, because you've forgotten what's underneath. You've spent so many years being the version of yourself the room wanted that you're no longer certain there's a version of yourself that belongs to you. That uncertainty is not a dead end. It's a beginning. It's the first honest thing you've felt in a very long time. Machiavelli would say, the man who can see the trap is already halfway out of it. You're starting to see the trap. That matters more than it might feel like right now. 2, everything you buried is still there. There's a version of you that never got to exist, not the idealized version, not some fantasy of who you could have been under perfect circumstances. The ordinary, messy, real version, the one with the anger that was labeled too intense, the ambition that was called selfish, the sadness that was told to pull itself together, the hunger for something different that got filed under ungrateful and set aside. That version didn't disappear because it was rejected. It went underground. Machiavelli saw this dynamic play out constantly in the political world he navigated. He watched men bury their real ambitions, their actual convictions, their genuine responses to things, because expressing them felt too dangerous. And for a while, the burial worked. The surface stayed smooth, the performance held. But then it came out sideways, in the decisions that seemed inexplicable to everyone around them, in the sudden eruptions of fury that had clearly been building for years, in the betrayals that looked impulsive but were actually the long-delayed expression of something that had never been allowed a proper outlet. In the self-sabotage, and Machiavelli watched this happen and again, of men who claimed to want one thing and then, at the moment of getting it, destroyed it themselves. He didn't have a psychological framework for why this happened, but he documented it with the precision of someone who found it genuinely fascinating. He called it the invisible force that overrides a man's stated intentions. The thing that moves beneath the surface of what people say they want and quietly steers them toward what they've never been willing to admit they feel. We would call it the buried self, the part of you that was folded down so many times it stopped making noise, but never stopped existing. Here's what the burial actually costs you. And I want to be specific because this is not abstract. It shows up in the anger that comes out of nowhere and seems completely disproportionate to what triggered it. You're not actually angry about the thing in front of you. You're angry about 10 years of swallowing something that needed to be said. And this moment just happened to be the one where the pressure finally found a crack. It shows up in the jealousy that doesn't make sense on the surface. The sharp, uncomfortable feeling when someone else has the thing you told yourself you didn't want. You didn't bury the wanting. You just buried the acknowledgement of it. And watching someone else live openly what you've been living secretly is a particular kind of pain that has no clean name. It shows up in the relationships you keep damaging right when they get genuinely close. Something in you, the part that learned early that being fully known is dangerous, pulls away precisely when real intimacy becomes available. You don't do it consciously. You just find yourself suddenly critical, suddenly unavailable, suddenly aware of every reason this particular person or situation isn't quite right. Machiavelli wrote that men deceive themselves far more readily than they deceive others. He watched rulers convince themselves they were acting from principle when they were acting from fear, that they were being strategic when they were being avoidant, that they were waiting for the right moment when they were simply afraid of the current one. The buried material doesn't announce itself. It disguises itself as reason, as practicality, as patience, as maturity. You think you're being thoughtful. You're actually running a pattern that was installed so long ago you've completely lost sight of its origin. The only way out of this, and Machiavelli was unambiguous about the value of seeing clearly even when clarity is painful, is to stop explaining away your own reactions and start getting curious about them. Not guilty, not ashamed, curious. Why does this particular thing activate something in me this particular way? What is it carrying that the surface situation alone can't account for? That question, asked honestly and sat with patiently, is the beginning of getting your buried self back. And you need it back. Not because it will make life easier, it won't at first, but because without it, you are not fully in your own life. You're managing a performance of it. And there is a specific, quiet grief that comes from reaching the end of something and realizing you were never quite present for it. 3, the moment the performance stopped being worth it. At some point, the cost of keeping up the performance gets higher than the cost of dropping it. Most people don't notice this shift when it happens. They notice the symptoms afterward, the flatness that sits over everything, the conversations that feel like work, the invitations they keep declining without quite knowing why, the slow, quiet evaporation of the energy that used to make social life feel natural. They assume something is wrong with them, that they've become antisocial or depressed or difficult, that they've lost something they used to have and need to get back. What they've actually lost is the willingness to pay a price they used to pay automatically. Machiavelli understood political transitions better than anyone of his era. He watched regimes collapse, alliances break, rulers who seemed completely stable suddenly lose everything. And he kept asking the same question. What is the actual moment of rupture? When does the old order stop being sustainable? His answer was not what most people expected. It wasn't a single dramatic event. It was the accumulation of small frictions that the system could no longer absorb. The moment when the cost of maintaining the pretense exceeded what the people inside it were willing to pay. That's exactly what's happening inside you. The pretense, the version of yourself you've been maintaining for the room, for the group, for the people who needed you to be a particular thing, has been accumulating friction. Every conversation where you said the expected thing instead of the true thing was a small deposit. Every room you entered and immediately started calculating how to be received was a withdrawal. Every time you laughed at something that wasn't funny, agreed with something you didn't believe, stayed quiet when you needed to speak. Those were costs, small ones, but they compound, and at some point, the account runs empty. That's not weakness, that's math. The symptoms of this moment are specific, and you probably recognize more of them than you'd expect. Small talk starts to feel like a language you're translating on the spot. Real-time, exhausting, in a way it never used to be. You're not antisocial. You haven't suddenly developed contempt for ordinary conversation. You've just lost the automatic fluency that comes from genuinely not minding the gap between what you say and what you think. The gap has become too wide, and bridging it every time with every person in every room, that takes something out of you now. You start going home earlier, not because you dislike the people, because being there requires you to be a version of yourself you can no longer find easily. The old character, the one who knew exactly how to play the room, who had the right responses ready, who could move through a social evening without friction, that character has gotten harder to locate. And performing without fully inhabiting the performance is even more tiring than the genuine thing. You stop explaining yourself when people misunderstand you, not out of indifference, out of a slowly building recognition that some people's version of you was never really about you. It was about what they needed you to be. And no amount of explanation reaches past that kind of need. So you let the misunderstanding stand, not because it doesn't matter, because spending energy correcting it feels like pouring water into something with no bottom. Machiavelli would recognize all of this immediately. He wrote about the man who, having maintained a useful appearance for years, suddenly finds he can no longer sustain the effort, not because the appearance was wrong, but because the gap between appearance and reality has grown too costly to bridge. He called this the moment of maximum danger, not because the man was failing, because he was finally becoming honest. And honesty in a world built on managed impressions is inherently destabilizing. From the outside, this looks like withdrawal, like something going wrong. From the inside, and this is the thing no one tells you, it feels like the first honest breath you've taken in years. That breath is not a problem to be solved. It is the whole point. 4. Why the world punishes people who stop pretending. When you stop performing, the people around you don't just let you change. They push back. Not always loudly, not always consciously, but the push is real, and it comes from every direction at once. From your closest relationships, from the group dynamics you've been part of for years, from the invisible social contract you signed so long ago you forgot it was a contract. And if you don't understand why this happens, it can break you. It can send you back. It can make you believe that the problem is the change rather than the resistance to it. Machiavelli wrote that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in introducing a new order of things. He was talking about political reform. But apply it to something simpler and closer. Apply it to the decision to stop being the person everyone in your life has agreed to need. That is introducing a new order of things into your friendships, into your family, into the group that has been organized in part around the version of you that used to show up reliably and play its role without friction. And Machiavelli's warning is precise. You will have as enemies all those who did well under the old order, and only lukewarm defenders among those who might do well under the new. Think about what that means in the ordinary scale of your life. The people who were comfortable with the performing version of you, who relied on your reliability, your agreeableness, your willingness to be whatever the room needed, feel the loss of that version as a kind of taking. You didn't ask their permission, you just changed, and they didn't agree to give up what they had. The first response from the group is almost always an attempt to pull you back in. It comes dressed as concern, as humor, as the gentle social pressure of, come on, don't be so serious lately, you've been so distant. Is everything okay? We miss you. You used to be more fun. These are not attacks. They are the group's immune system doing exactly what immune systems do, identifying a disturbance and attempting to restore equilibrium. The group is not trying to harm you. The group doesn't even know it's doing this. It is simply responding to the fact that one of its members has stopped behaving predictably, and unpredictability in a system built on mutual performance is experienced as a threat. When the gentle pulling doesn't work, the interpretation shifts. Distant, cold, arrogant, thinks they're better than everyone else. And here is what makes those labels so effective, even when you know they aren't true. They're just close enough to something real that you can't fully dismiss them, because there are people who pull away because they genuinely are contemptuous, because they have become cold. And when the same language that describes their failure gets applied to your growth, the doubt finds a crack. Am I becoming difficult? Is this actually growth? Or is this just a story I'm telling myself to make the loneliness feel meaningful? Machiavelli anticipated exactly this dynamic. He wrote that men will forgive the loss of a father more readily than the loss of their patrimony, their inheritance, their stake, the thing they were counting on. What he meant is that people can absorb genuine grief. What they struggle to forgive is the feeling that something they relied on has been taken without their consent. When you stop performing your role, that's what people feel. The comfortable version of you, the one that made them feel a certain way, that filled a certain function, that never demanded that they examine themselves, that version is gone. And they didn't agree to give it up. So they apply pressure. Subtle at first, then less subtle. And if that doesn't work, if you continue to hold the new shape against the weight of their expectation, the warmth starts withdrawing. The invitations thin. The old ease of belonging becomes something you have to actively work to maintain, and the work feels wrong in a way it never used to. This is not personal. That's the crucial thing to hold on to. Machiavelli was ruthlessly clear about this. The resistance you're encountering is not a verdict on who you're becoming. It is a predictable structural response from people who are operating from their own interests, their own fears, their own need to keep things the way they were. Understanding that, really understanding it, not just intellectually, but in the moment when the pressure is landing, is what allows you to keep moving without being destroyed by it. 5. What grows in the quiet. Most people treat silence as a problem to be solved. Not silence in the musical sense, silence in the social sense. The absence of plans, of noise, of the constant low hum of other people's company, they fill it immediately with their phone, their TV, their calendar, their obligations, anything to keep the quiet from becoming too large. Because when it gets large enough, things start coming through it. And not all of those things are comfortable, but there's another way to be in silence. And the people who find it, who stop running from it and start actually sitting in it, discover something that cannot be found anywhere else. Machiavelli found it by accident. After 20 years in the center of Florentine political life, years of serving, negotiating, advising, maneuvering, he was arrested, accused of conspiracy, imprisoned, and tortured, then released, then exiled to his small farm in Sant'Andrea, stripped of everything he'd spent his adult life building. He described those early months of exile as humiliation, as loss, as the particular cruelty of a man built for the center, finding himself suddenly at the margins, watching from a distance while the world he knew continued without him. And then something shifted. He wrote about it in a letter to a friend, one of the most remarkable letters in the entire history of political thought. He described his days, the ordinary routines of a man with too much time and nowhere particular to be. And then in the evenings he would go into his study. He would take off his working clothes, covered with the dust and mud of a day spent doing nothing important, and put on his finest robes. And dressed appropriately, he wrote, he would enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where he was received kindly. He was reading. He was thinking. He was, for the first time in decades, not performing for anyone. And in that space, the quiet of a man with no audience left to play to, he wrote The Prince. He wrote his histories. He produced the work that outlasted every ruler he had ever served. What Machiavelli found in that exile, and what he never quite said directly but wrote around continuously, was that the interior life becomes available when the exterior performance stops. When you are not managing how you appear, you can finally meet your own mind. Your actual thinking surfaces, not the thoughts you've shaped for the room, not the opinions calibrated for the company, but the ones that live underneath. Quieter, more honest, more genuinely yours than anything you've said in years. Your real sense of what matters starts to clarify. Things that once seemed important, the approval, the belonging, the smooth management of other people's impressions of you, begin to look like what they actually were. Costly distractions from the work of figuring out who you are and what you actually want to do with whatever time you have left. And things you'd set aside, the projects you never started, the questions you never followed, the directions you told yourself were impractical or premature or not the right moment, those things start pulling at you with a weight that surprises you. This is not depression. It is not withdrawal from life. It is life, finally making itself available without the noise of performance getting in the way. The solitude that feels like exile at first, the silence that feels like something has been taken from you, eventually reveals itself as the only space where real thinking actually happens, where your compass, freed from the constant pressure of other people's expectations, starts pointing somewhere more genuinely your own. Machiavelli spent 2 years in that silence before he understood what it had given him. You may not have 2 years, but the direction is the same. Stop filling the quiet, just for a while. Let it get large enough that the things which have been waiting in it can finally reach you. What comes through won't always be comfortable. It won't always be clear. but it will be yours. And that, after so many years of performing for other people's approval, will feel like the most unfamiliar and most necessary thing in the world. 5. What grows in the quiet. Most people treat silence as a problem to be solved. Not silence in the musical sense, silence in the social sense. The absence of plans, of noise, of the constant low hum of other people's company, they fill it immediately with their phone, their TV, their calendar, their obligations, anything to keep the quiet from becoming too large. Because when it gets large enough, things start coming through it. And not all of those things are comfortable, but there's another way to be in silence. And the people who find it, who stop running from it and start actually sitting in it, discover something that cannot be found anywhere else. Machiavelli found it by accident. After 20 years in the center of Florentine political life, years of serving, negotiating, advising, maneuvering, he was arrested, accused of conspiracy, imprisoned, and tortured, then released, then exiled to his small farm in Sant'Andrea, stripped of everything he'd spent his adult life building. He described those early months of exile as humiliation, as loss, as the particular cruelty of a man built for the center, finding himself suddenly at the margins, watching from a distance while the world he knew continued without him. And then something shifted. He wrote about it in a letter to a friend, one of the most remarkable letters in the entire history of political thought. He described his days, the ordinary routines of a man with too much time and nowhere particular to be. And then in the evenings he would go into his study. He would take off his working clothes, covered with the dust and mud of a day spent doing nothing important, and put on his finest robes. And dressed appropriately, he wrote, he would enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where he was received kindly. He was reading. He was thinking. He was, for the first time in decades, not performing for anyone. And in that space, the quiet of a man with no audience left to play to, he wrote The Prince. He wrote his histories. He produced the work that outlasted every ruler he had ever served. What Machiavelli found in that exile, and what he never quite said directly but wrote around continuously, was that the interior life becomes available when the exterior performance stops. When you are not managing how you appear, you can finally meet your own mind. Your actual thinking surfaces, not the thoughts you've shaped for the room, not the opinions calibrated for the company, but the ones that live underneath. Quieter, more honest, more genuinely yours than anything you've said in years. Your real sense of what matters starts to clarify. Things that once seemed important, the approval, the belonging, the smooth management of other people's impressions of you, begin to look like what they actually were. Costly distractions from the work of figuring out who you are and what you actually want to do with whatever time you have left. And things you'd set aside, the projects you never started, the questions you never followed, the directions you told yourself were impractical or premature or not the right moment, those things start pulling at you with a weight that surprises you. This is not depression. It is not withdrawal from life. It is life, finally making itself available without the noise of performance getting in the way. The solitude that feels like exile at first, the silence that feels like something has been taken from you, eventually reveals itself as the only space where real thinking actually happens, where your compass, freed from the constant pressure of other people's expectations, starts pointing somewhere more genuinely your own. Machiavelli spent 2 years in that silence before he understood what it had given him. You may not have 2 years, but the direction is the same. Stop filling the quiet, just for a while. Let it get large enough that the things which have been waiting in it can finally reach you. What comes through won't always be comfortable, it won't always be clear, but it will be yours. And that, after so many years of performing for other people's approval, will feel like the most unfamiliar and most necessary thing in the world. 7. The price and the gift. Let's not pretend this is free. Everything worth having costs something. And the particular thing we've been talking about, the process of becoming more genuinely yourself in a world that rewards performance, costs more than most people expect. It costs things that are hard to replace, and it costs them before it gives you anything back. Machiavelli was clear about this. He had no patience for accounts of transformation that skipped the price. He said that the wounds a man inflicts on himself in the course of doing what is necessary should be inflicted quickly, so that the bitterness passes and the benefit becomes clear. But they are wounds nonetheless. The first cost is a kind of loneliness that doesn't fully go away, not the sharp, aching loneliness of being rejected or left out, more like the quieter, more persistent loneliness of someone who has become specific, who knows what they think and what they don't think, who has a shape now, a real one, and has accepted that not everyone will want to be close to a shape like that. The comfortable shapelessness of the performing self had a kind of social warmth built into it. People could project onto it whatever they needed. Now that the projection surface is gone, some of them lose interest, some of them become uncomfortable, some of them simply drift. That loss is real, and it arrives before the replacement does. The second cost is that you can't go back to not seeing. Once you understand how the performance works in yourself and in other people, you can't unsee it. The mechanics of social life become visible in a way that removes a certain kind of innocence. You watch people performing their roles, and you know now that they're performing, including yourself, in the moments when you still do it. That knowledge is clarifying. It is also, on certain days, exhausting. There are days you would give a great deal to be able to walk into a room and just be comfortable without analyzing what's happening underneath the surface of everything. The third cost is the full weight of your own choices. You can't point to the group anymore. Can't say everyone was doing it, that you were just following along. When you live from the inside out, when you make decisions from your own values rather than from the group's expectations, you own what follows. That is not a burden exactly. It is more like the specific gravity of a life that is actually yours. But on hard days, it sits very heavily. Machiavelli wrote that men ought either to be well treated or crushed, because from slight offenses they can take revenge, but for great ones they cannot. He was talking about enemies, but apply it to yourself and the choice you're facing. Don't do this halfway. Don't become permanently suspended between the person you were and the person you're becoming. Half real, half performing, belonging fully to neither world. That is the most uncomfortable position possible. The cost without the gift. Either go back fully. There is no shame in it. The performing life has real consolations, warmth, belonging, the comfort of knowing your role. If you choose it consciously, knowing what it costs, that is a legitimate choice, and you can live it well, or keep going all the way through. Because on the other side of the price, and this is the thing Machiavelli spent his exile discovering, though he never quite said it this directly, the gift is enormous. The gift is that you become someone you can actually respect, not in the way that needs an audience, in the quiet, private way of a person who has looked at themselves with honest eyes and not looked away, who faced the buried material and didn't run, who paid the cost of becoming real and got to keep what they found on the other side. The gift is that when you are alone, in the silence that once felt like punishment, you are in good company, because the person who's there with you is real, and you know them. And knowing them, finally, feels like the most valuable thing you've ever acquired. The gift is a freedom that cannot be given or taken by anyone else. Not freedom from pain. You will still hurt. Not freedom from loss. You will still grieve. Not freedom from loneliness. There will still be days when the distance between yourself and the people around you feels very wide. But freedom from the specific exhaustion of a life organized around other people's approval. Freedom to think your own thoughts, feel what you actually feel. Walk into any room and know, without calculation, who you are. Machiavelli called this virtù, the inner quality that allows a man to act from his own center regardless of what fortune throws at him. Not luck, not advantage, the real thing. The thing that was always available and that most people spend their whole lives circling without ever quite reaching. You are circling it right now. The question is whether you keep going. If you've stayed this long, something in this landed, not just intellectually, in the specific way that things land when they're not just interesting, but true, when they describe something you've been living but hadn't yet found the words for. So let me say this directly. The distance you feel from people you used to feel close to, that is not you becoming cold. That is you becoming honest. The silence you keep returning to, that is not isolation, that is orientation. You're finding out which direction is actually yours. The sense that the life you've been living doesn't quite fit anymore, that the role doesn't match the person you're becoming. That is not a crisis. That is the old structure making room for something larger. Machiavelli spent years in exile before he understood what the exile had given him. He thought it was humiliation. It turned out to be the only circumstance in which the work he was actually built for could finally get done. Your version of this is different. Smaller in scale, probably. More personal, less dramatic. But the shape of it is the same. The thing that feels like loss is making space for something that could not have grown alongside the performance. The quiet that feels like emptiness is actually the first condition in which you can hear yourself clearly. And the not fitting in, the specific uncomfortable sense that the rooms you used to move through easily now feel slightly wrong, that is not evidence that something is broken. That is evidence that you have gotten too real for the performance, that the person you are becoming no longer fits inside the shape the old version of you was trained to hold. Machiavelli ended The Prince with a call to action, a direct address to the reader, stripped of all the strategic framing, just honest urgency. He said this opportunity must not be allowed to pass. He was talking about political liberation. But the instruction translates. This moment, this particular moment of discomfort and clarity, and the growing sense that something has to change, is the opportunity, not a permanent state, not a condition that will wait for you indefinitely, a window. And the people who take it are the ones who end up years later with a life that is actually theirs. The people who don't take it, who turn back toward the comfort of the old performance, who decide that the cost of changing is higher than the cost of staying, are not failures. They are human. But they carry something afterward, a quiet, persistent sense of a road not taken, a life that was comfortable but never quite fit, a performance that got better and better while the person performing it got further and further from themselves. 4 seconds. You don't have to take the opportunity today. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to keep moving in the direction that feels honest rather than the direction that feels safe. That's it. That's the whole thing. One honest step and then another. And eventually, not quickly, not without cost, but eventually you'll look up and realize that the life you're living is one you actually recognize, that the person in it is someone you actually know, that the quiet at some point stopped feeling like exile and started feeling like home.